breaches of the peace.
I'm going to come back to that.
Yeah.
I'm going to take your comment.
I was going to say, just to sort of play devil's advocate, like I hate Bill O'Reilly, you know, I'm very pro-choice, and the George Tiller thing just really shook me too. But like, let's say that, let's sort of like turn the tables, and like if it was like Keith Olbermann, and we had sort of like a modern day Mengele, who's performing all sorts of experiments, and not to totally liken abortion providers to that, but just let's say that someone like Keith Olbermann was saying, look, you know, people need to be aware that this is what's going on, and start sort of doing a consciousness raising. I don't think Bill O'Reilly crossed the line to incitement to violence. I think, like, I mean, it's semi-hate speech, but to...
He made Tiller the Killer a household name.
Oh,
I think
okay,
at that point,
okay, that I wasn't
at that point you're crossing, you're now getting into a different...
Okay, so that I missed.
Because you're talking about a situation where there's a real guy doing horrible things, but in Tiller's case, he was a fantastic doctor, a saint, and he was just being slandered like crazy.
But if
you're opposed to abortion, and you see that as murder, like I can understand. I wasn't aware of the Tiller the Killer part.
Yeah.
But
they still attacked Tiller personally in ways that
I know. But what I just mean is like
was the
single out
insight?
someone
I didn't.
without like an actual.
Over 20 times on a show, he would talk about it and say Tiller the baby killer, and
But
say all kinds of lies.
Did he ever tell people to actually take action?
No.
He did everything
He did everything short of that.
Everything short of that?
So it's like, you know, my wife's sleeping in the next room, and there just happens to be this knife here, and I'm going to go over here, and boy, I wish my wife was dead. None of those things is me telling you to kill my wife. I'm not married, by the way. But
what was the knife in this? What was the knife in this context?
He is the broadcasting, the singling out of this person.
Yeah.
The vivid and often inaccurate description of what he does, what he represents, who he is. The deputizing of a bunch of unrelated arguments to paint a picture that the world would be a better place if this guy wasn't in it. In this case, he's leading people down a path. The question of intent becomes relevant because whether or not he was making a case for public concern, or whether it was that he actually wanted someone to go out and kill the guy. The fact that he wasn't at all remorseful after the fact leads me to think not only is he a turd sandwich, but that he may have in fact wanted that to happen. He may have in fact been happy.
Well, yeah, but wanting it to happen doesn't mean he expects it to happen.
And again, we're now into the fine line between incitement and specific incitement is obviously off the table.
Yeah.
General tendency towards incitement, is that dangerous? Does that qualify as hate speech? I want to bring up 2 points just to throw into the discussion. The first is the chief reason why I oppose hate speech laws is the arbitrary nature of them, that certain groups are protected and certain groups aren't, and that can shift depending on the political winds. That threatens me personally because civil rights activists could have been construed, because they had incredibly controversial and unpopular opinions at the time, could have been construed as hate speech, trying to bring down society, that they were disruptive to the good conduct of society because they wanted to overthrow the general way of things, and it would have thrown into political upheaval if a whole segment of the population that didn't have a political voice all of a sudden had one. So the question that comes out of that is, how can we make the protected groups, how can we make that less arbitrary, or must it always remain arbitrary as a matter of course? The second has to do with pejorative terms, and again, I'm speaking from my own context, pejorative terms, specifically the word, and I'm using this as a descriptive term, and so please excuse it, but I'm using it in an academic sense, the word nigger. My father emigrated to Canada in the 1970s, during a time when it would have been totally normal for him to have been described by people he worked with, by people he knew socially, as, oh yeah, that nigger who's working in the hospital. That kind of speech has the effect of making a group of people, specifically black people, second class. That it is a pejorative term, there is no positive connotation to that word. That word has completely disappeared from the public context and had nothing to do with it being illegal, because it's completely legal for me to call all y'all a bunch of niggers. So the question then becomes, if there's sort of a two-pronged question. If hate speech laws do have the effect of reducing the amount of hate speech, which they may or may not, I think they probably do, does that have an effect that echoes through and actually does protect minorities? Or is the fact that the law didn't have to come into effect for there to be a major sea change in how minority groups in general, and black people specifically, are viewed? The fact that we didn't need the hate speech laws to see that happening, does that make them redundant? So, arbitrary, redundant, or do they have an effect? Discuss.
I would like to draw everyone's attention to the fact that you don't necessarily have to be convicted under hate laws to suffer financial ruin.
That's the case with any criminal accusation, though.
True, but I mean, what I'm referring to is the case of Lorna Pardee. Now, as extreme examples like Lenny Bruce or Sam Kinison show, stand-up comedians do not comply with the current code of political correctness. They are given and take a wide degree of latitude in what they say. Now, on Commercial Drive, a stand-up comedian, a very lousy stand-up comedian, I might add, was being heckled by Lorna Pardee. She was making out with her girlfriend.
I was there that night.
And according to witnesses, she was quite drunk. And the guy retorted by making some snide remarks, some of which touched on her sexual orientation. Now, whether or not he deserved to be prosecuted, the case against him was eventually thrown out. He was bankrupted. His legal fees amounted to about $40,000. But more to the point, a totally innocent third party, the owner or proprietor of that cafe, was also driven to the brink of bankruptcy because his cafe was brought into the legal action. I think that a serious breach of freedom of speech occurred here because nobody ended up getting convicted, and yet two people, one of whom had never said anything to anybody, he just had the misfortune to own that cafe. They were bankrupted by the legal fees they had to come up with.
It does happen, but that is the case. That is the case with many, many, many crimes, not specifically hate speech. So that is an issue of maybe legal system reform in general, but that's not really germane only to hate speech, because people who are accused of sexual assault that may or may not have done it, there's all kinds of liability laws where people get bankrupted and they didn't do anything wrong. So that's sort of related but tangential, and I don't want to go too far down that road.
Somewhat similar, but sort of on the hate speech, it just seems that it would tie up a lot of public discourse, is that if someone says one thing and all of a sudden they're in court, someone is, they're charged, whatever, by the time it works its way through the court system, there's going to be a lot of reticence in the media and within the public discourse to continue that conversation for fear of further prosecution, even if it ends up being, completely thrown out of court. So it just seems that because it's arbitrary, that it just has too much potential to.
The point of hate speech laws, you were talking about it's not a good thing to reduce the amount of hate.
Not always. Not necessarily. I mean, I would like to increase the amount of hate for Bill O'Reilly, like for his ideas.
Not actual hate, though.
For his ideas.
His ideas, but not of him.
Not of him.
Okay.
Oh. Why not?
So
Yes,
the point of
Yeah.
hate speech laws, and you were talking about the civil rights movement and the possibility that might have stood in the way of things like that. Is the point of hate speech laws to make everyone more peaceful and lovey-dovey and that sort of thing? Or is it to simply avoid personal harm, to come to people who are being spoken about?
I think it's to reduce harm and discrimination. I think those two go hand in hand.
So have those two things dropped since the introduction of hate speech laws in Canada? Was that something that science can be used to assess. And if it doesn't have the intended effect, then and it has other effects like stifling discussion of controversial ideas, then we should not have them. Are you
Well, it's a
aware of
cost
any-
benefit.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, even if it does have the intended
Yeah.
effect, if the other, if the side effects outweigh the intended effect, then it's still
Yeah,
an
sure.
issue.
Sure.
So-
And do you know if there has been any
I don't,
examination?
to my knowledge, no one's actually, but that would be an incredibly difficult thing to measure.
Yeah.
There are so many other things that we have to
Because you're
control.
saying
Could you-
ideas are being driven underground. You asked that question. Are controversial ideas being driven underground? You said you go to the Craigslist rants and raves section and you see all sorts of hate speech about all sorts of things. So the ideas aren't necessarily going away.
No.
And
They're simply less public.
here in Canada, I mean, I don't know about anybody else, but I've myself been privy to many conversations that include hate speech that are private conversations that are in public. So just the fact that we have a hate speech law is certainly not stopping widespread conversations in private of hate. So I don't know if that's actually a prevention of these hate things being spread to each other. It's in a different way. It's not through a public means. It's just going to go from one person to another to another. And I think that's actually more likely to be misconstrued or not, not coming up against another opinion of how that could be wrong.
But even in our own lifetimes, I don't think you can deny that the amount of open, and even in private conversations, openly racist and homophobic speech has declined precipitously in the past 20, 25 years.
Is that
I
because
guess
people are not
I'm
allowed
gonna
to,
lie
or is it because people have just...
So there's the question. Is
Because
the,
you become a
Well-
pariah, I think. If you go around calling black people niggers or anything like that, you do become a pariah.
right.
But the Congress actually, when you brought that up just a couple of minutes ago, the funny thing to me is what I see is happening with women is almost the opposite. Is now it's really okay to call women bitches. In like the younger generation, boy, do I see it all over the media. It was like the first swear that was allowed on television was bitch, these, to me, that's a hateful thing to say.
That's what
But-
she said is quite popular too, all the time.
That
what she
hasn't been prosecuted under these state laws in Canada, but boy, do I see it, on MTV or this or that. I've seen it all over the street. Nobody is doing anything about that.
Well, I'm sure you've heard about the slut walk that happened in Toronto and Boston. So there is a group of people who are trying to subvert some of those language norms.
It's coming to Vancouver.
I'm marching, man. I'm going to be there.
Yeah.
Anyway, so, but
It's funny to me that that's become more acceptable. I mean, when I was like 20 years ago, when I was like 20 years old, there's no way that was acceptable to hear in high school or what have you.
Yeah.
When I really, waitressed my little way through university, etc., and I'm hearing these kids, and even the girls, they're accepting that being called bitch is okay. And to me, that's really hateful. Nobody's doing anything about it, so it's kind of like pick and choose who gets prosecuted still.
But I would point out that bitch has not just been applied as a pejorative against women. I witnessed a heated argument between two homosexual males on a bus recently, and at one point, one of the men having the argument called his partner a bitch.
I can call a straight man a fag, and then use that same argument to say, well, it doesn't mean it's not a pejorative term for gay people anymore because straight people call each other fag. I don't think that that's the word bitch, when applied to anyone, especially when applied to men, is to liken the man to a woman, and then to say that by equation it is worse to be a woman.